The night Thomas Hale learned what a promise could cost a man, the rain fell in thin, relentless sheets, tapping against the narrow hospital window like impatient fingers counting down what little time remained. The room was dim, heavy with the smell of antiseptic and endings. Daniel Cross lay on the bed, his body a battlefield long after the war had ended, his breathing shallow and uneven, each breath sounding like it might be his last. Thomas stood beside him in silence, hat clenched in his hands, feeling smaller than he ever had under enemy fire. Daniel had been more than a friend, he had been a brother. The man who dragged Thomas from a burning trench, the man who shared his last water and his last laugh when hope ran thin. Now Daniel's eyes searched Thomas's face with an urgency that made his chest tighten. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice was barely a rasp, yet every word carried the weight of a lifetime. He did not speak of medals or regrets. He spoke of Clara May Whitfield, the woman the town whispered about, the woman marked by fire and forgotten by kindness. Daniel's trembling fingers clutched Thomas's sleeve as he begged him to promise to marry her, to protect her from a world that had never shown mercy, to stand beside her when Daniel no longer could. Panic rose in Thomas's throat. Marriage was not charity. It was a lifetime. He thought of the stares, the judgment, the scars etched across Clara's face. He thought of how easy it would be to stay silent. But Daniel's eyes never wavered. And in that moment, Thomas knew refusing would haunt him longer than any war. He nodded. "I promise." Daniel smiled, soft, grateful, finally at peace, and with that smile he was gone. Thomas left the hospital carrying more than grief. He carried a vow forged in death. Clara lived on the edge of town, where the road turned to dirt and houses thinned, as if even civilization hesitated to go further. When Thomas arrived days later, he did not find a broken woman dressed in mourning. He found Clara splitting firewood behind her weather-worn house, sleeves rolled high, muscles tense with effort. One side of her face bore the jagged scars left by a childhood fire, marks the town never let her forget, but her eyes were steady and unafraid. She listened as Thomas told her Daniel was gone, nodding once, no tears falling. Grief lived in her silence. When Thomas spoke of the promise, offering marriage out of honor and obligation, Clara laughed, a short, bitter sound. She told him she was not a debt to be paid, not a burden to be carried because a dying man asked it. She had survived fire, hunger, and loneliness without pity, and she did not want charity now. Shame burned through Thomas, yet when he turned to leave, she stopped him. If he meant the promise, not as sacrifice but as choice, she would consider it. Because even the strongest people grew tired of standing alone. The wedding was small and uncomfortable. The town watched with thin smiles and sharp whispers. A war hero marrying a scarred, penniless woman. Some called it noble. Others called it foolish. That night, lying beside a woman who was his wife in name but still a stranger in heart, Thomas realized the promise had already begun to change him. Marriage did not soften Clara, it sharpened her. She rose before dawn, worked without complaint, and faced the world without apology. Thomas noticed the look she received: curiosity, discussed cruelty, and how she never flinched. When a shopkeeper hesitated to serve her, she waited calmly. When women whispered, she walked slower, not faster. Thomas burned with anger, ready to fight every insult. But Clara never asked him to. When a man laughed openly at her scars, Thomas stepped forward, fists clenched. Clara caught his arm and shook her head. "Don't," she said quietly. "I've survived worse than words." In that moment, Thomas realized his instinct to protect came from fear, not strength. Clara did not need saving. She needed respect. At night, Thomas heard the cost of her courage. Her breathing changed when storms came. Once, thunder froze her in place, eyes distant. She spoke little of the fire, but when she did, her words stayed with him. Fire teaches you how fast everything can be taken, and how much you can lose without dying. Money grew scarce. One morning, Clara returned without her wedding ring. She said nothing. When Thomas confronted her, anger shaking his voice, she answered calmly, "Rings don't feed us. Pride won't keep us warm." He felt humbled. He had worn sacrifice like a badge. Clara shed it without ceremony. Slowly, trust grew. Thomas spoke of the war, of blood-soaked nights and friends he could not save. Clara listened without judgment, sitting beside him through nightmares, grounding him with a steady hand and whispered words. "You're here. You survived. One evening, Thomas asked how she carried fear so lightly. She met his gaze. I don't. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing not to let it decide who you are. The truth struck him hard. He had married her out of duty. Loving her required a deeper courage, humility, patience, and the willingness to be changed. When sickness swept through town, it took Clara too. Fever stole her strength, and Thomas sat by her bed, praying for the first time in years. When she survived, squeezing his hand and smiling weakly, Thomas wept openly. He understood then what Daniel had seen all along. This woman, poor, scarred, underestimated, was the bravest soul he had ever known. He had promised to marry her, but she had taught him how to live. If this story touched your heart, reminded you that true courage often wears scars and walks quietly, subscribe to the channel. We share powerful stories of love, sacrifice, and strength that deserve to be heard. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most.